Welcome to Unit 6 of the PrePurchase 1 Fundamentals of PrePurchase Homebuyer Counseling course. We'll discuss HUD program requirements. This section is completely based on the 2010 HUD Housing Counseling Handbook, which is available online on HUD's website and also among the resources for this course. This unit will provide an overview of funding, file management, policies, audits, protocols, reporting, and the Housing Counseling Handbook. First, we'll discuss how to become a HUD certified agency. To receive HUD funds, an agency must meet basic eligibility requirements, including having a 501c3 nonprofit status, have at least 1 year of experience, and be located in the community that it intends to serve for at least 1 year. The agency must also have funding in place to deliver the service because HUD funds cannot be considered a primary funding source. There are 3 ways to obtain HUD funding and agency approval. The first shown on the chart here is through an intermediary. There are 39 intermediaries in the U.S., each of them having a different area of focus. So the intermediary would apply for the HUD funding, and then it would choose local nonprofits through an application process to provide the services to the clients. The second method of obtaining HUD funding and approval is through state housing finance authorities. Again, the Housing Finance Agency receives the funding from HUD and then funnels it to the nonprofits. Third, and finally, local nonprofits can apply directly to HUD for HUD funding and agency approval. Funding for housing counseling can only be received through one of these entities, either through an intermediary, through a state housing finance authority, or directly through HUD. Receiving funding from 2 of those sources is considered double dipping, and if that occurs, then the additional funding must be returned. On the other hand, an agency may maintain agency approval through multiple entities. However, they may only receive funding from one funding source of HUD funds. The NOFA is the Notice of Funding Availability, or the way that you may apply to HUD for direct funding. The application is released through the HUD.gov website in the spring, and agencies have about 4 to 6 weeks to complete the application, and then funding decisions are released in the fall. You may also apply to an intermediary for funding. Each of these intermediaries have various areas of specialization, such as a minority group or demographic. So it would be wise to research the intermediaries and identify if your agency aligns with one or more of the intermediaries' goals to identify one to apply with. Each of the intermediaries will manage their application timelines and processes differently. They'll also provide different funding amounts and production and reporting requirements. Let's go on to discuss types of housing counseling. HUD recognizes the following counseling types: pre-purchase, mortgage default or foreclosure prevention, financial management for homeowners or home maintenance, and that would be for clients who are not delinquent, rental counseling, homeless counseling, and home equity conversion mortgage. So to make sure that you have a complete file, we need to be sure that we understand what HUD requires to be in a counseling file. This information can be found in the course manual and also in the HUD handbook in Chapter 5. You're required to have a client stacking order, which is a document that lists all of the documents that are required in the file in the sequence that you'll keep them filed throughout their service period in your agency. You'll also have to have a client intake form, an agency program description, client authorization form, credit report, and action plan. In that file, you must have a client log indicating all of the interactions with the client, a HUD case number. If you provide a loan product comparison, you must maintain documentation of that comparison, a client budget, any supporting documents for their budget, including, for example, credit card statements, bank statements, etc. Certificates that they receive through your agency. You must note the funding source that supported the services provided to this client, the fees that you've charged them, if any, a record of any follow-up communication, and then when you terminate them, a record of when and why they've been terminated, as well as closing information if they purchase a home. In a group education file, a slightly different list of documents are required. You must have a file number for the class. You must have course logistics and description. And it's not necessary to keep a separate file for each individual in a course. However, you must have a course file. And in that course file, you must also note the instructors that were present in that class or that participated in the class, an intake form that includes participant demographics, as well as a sign-in sheet to prove who attended the class, and a notation of how much of your HUD grant supported this course, or what percentage of the course was supported by HUD funds. We suggest that when you're working on maintaining your files that you try to be consistent in how documents are placed in the file. I feel that the client stacking order can be very helpful with this. If all of the counselors in the agency are using the same client stacking order and they're all committed and held responsible for keeping documents in that sequence, then it makes it easier for another person to pick up the file and find the documents they need, or during an audit your file will be ready for an auditor to review it. We suggest you use the same order of documents stacking from the time of intake through home ownership so you don't have to resort the documents. So I would start with the intake form on the bottom and then add additional documents on the top. Never keep loose items for proper placement later, because we all know how that goes. You just don't get around to it. And I also suggest that you keep all your notes in one place so that another staff member or an auditor can read all the client notes in sequence from beginning to end. You need to have a process in place for terminating files. Chapter 3 of the HUD Handbook expresses that you must follow up with the clients at least every 60 days. And in order to terminate a client file, you have to conduct a 3-touch rule. This means that you may contact the client by phone a few times, and if you're not getting a response after 2 calls, then you may send a letter, and a letter is required to work towards termination. And if you don't receive a response to that letter in 30 days, then you can note that in your file, along with all of the other notations of attempts to reach the client, and then state the reason for termination and the date. You can terminate a file for any of these reasons as listed in the HUD Handbook. If they meet their housing need, if counseling will not meet the client's housing need, if their need is beyond the service that you provide, if the agency attempts to but is unable to locate the client, if they refuse to follow the agreed upon action plan, if they choose to terminate housing counseling themselves, if they fail to appear for appointments, or they fail to respond to inquiries concerning their progress, or other circumstances beyond your agency's or client's control, such as a natural disaster. It was very helpful for me to learn this list because I feel that I was trying to keep client files open indefinitely. And it helped me to realize that if they, for example, do not follow the agreed upon action plan and I try to follow up with them to do that, and my attempts fail, then eventually I can use that as a reason to terminate a file and express to the client that they're not complying with the purposes of our agency and that they can seek services elsewhere. So that's just one example of how I felt empowered by this list of when to terminate a file. It's important for your clients to have this in mind, that really the goal is to close files and not to leave them open indefinitely. In the next section, we'll discuss more policies. Files are required to be stored in a locked cabinet. You must know where the key is and you must use that key. We've heard stories of agencies that had locking filing cabinets, but they didn't know where the keys were, so it wasn't really helpful when they were audited. The files must be stored for 3 years. Some subsidy requirements may require longer storage periods. Be sure to shred confidential information. It might be possible to use a local lending partner who has access to a commercial shredder. However, if you do that, be sure that you're maintaining control of those files until they're shredded. Create a written policy in your agency on how files will be stored and maintained. Counseling must occur in a private space. It cannot be a cubicle. It must have walls and doors on that space. The counselor must have access to a computer and copier. The building must be accessible to individuals with physical disabilities, and if that's not possible, then you must provide alternative locations for counseling. Some agencies choose to offer telephone counseling in addition to or instead of face-to-face counseling. Phone counseling can be very beneficial for rural areas, disabled clients, and working clients. However, the client file requirements are the same. Sometimes when we offer a service over the phone, it may be more difficult to gather documentation. However, we need to keep in mind that the same supporting documents are required, also the same signed authorizations are required, and you must try to follow up with the client every 60 days. As HUD-approved agencies, we are required to maintain working knowledge of HUD programs. Staff must be familiar with FHA programs and other HUD products and the Fair Housing Guidelines, as we've discussed in this course. HUD.gov is a good resource to maintain your staff up to date. To comply with HUD's guidelines for counseling non-English speakers, agencies must either hire a counselor that speaks the language of the clients being served or use an interpreting service. You may be able to find an interpreting service through a local college or university that might offer a discounted rate, or you may be able to form a partnership in some other way with an organization that offers interpreting. Avoid using children and family members as interpreters simply because you're discussing private information, and children really should not be the bearer of this information. Reporting guidelines. In this section, we'll review the HUD reporting requirements using the 9902 form, and we'll also discuss the Housing Counseling System, or HCS. Agencies that are funded directly through HUD submit a report on a quarterly basis in addition to the 9902 to HUD, and these requirements are in the grant agreement. Each intermediary has additional reporting requirements and deadlines, and some intermediaries submit reports directly to HUD for their subgrantees, but you would have to familiarize yourself with your intermediary's process. Quarterly, all agencies have to submit a 9902. This report gives a snapshot of the volume of clients being served within a given time period. Also, the Housing Counseling System, or HCS, is an online database managed by HUD for agency information that's posted to the HUD website, and agencies submit their 9902 data into HCS. Let's look at a sample of the 9902 form. In sections 1 and 2, you'll notice your basic agency information. I'd like to point out on the right the section here, Total Annual Housing Counseling Program Budget, all sources, and then the HUD funded activity ratio. So since HUD funding is only a percentage of your total annual housing counseling program budget, therefore your activity ratio would be the same percentage. So for example, let's say 10% of your funding comes from HUD, therefore 10% of your counseling would be your HUD funded activity ratio. In this section, you'll notice where you'll need to record the ethnicity of the households, whether they're Hispanic or not Hispanic, and this can simply be self-designated. On the right-hand side, you'll notice 3 columns here. You'll have one column that will have all counseling and education activities. So this is the total number of clients you see in the year. It doesn't matter what organization or entity funded them. And then on the right, you'll have 2 columns for HUD Housing Counseling Program grantees. So as we mentioned before, maybe this is only 10% of your total clients counseled. In the middle column, it says counseling and education activities attributed to HUD Housing Counseling Grant Funds actual to date. And on the right, it shows annual projection. I believe I can actually highlight these. Yeah. So the annual projection would be the amount that you expect to serve through the year, and the actual to date would be the current total of the number of people that you've served. We'll continue down. Here we have the race of households, as well as multi-race, and the income levels, which has changed since the 9902 was updated a year or so ago. You'll notice that these are in 3 different sections, Section 3, Section 4, and Section 5. These should all be equal to each other. So Section 3 total should equal the Section 4 total, which should equal the Section 5 total. Yep. Let me remove my highlights. There we go. All right, so in Section 6, this refers to the rural area status. You can use the USDA.gov website to identify the rural areas in your community. And Section 7 records which of your clients or how many of your clients are limited English proficient or not. Limited English proficient means that the client has a lesser ability or inability to speak, read, and write English proficiently. And there's guidance for this section in the website www.lep.gov, which stands for Limited English Proficiency. In Section 8, you will record the number of households receiving group education, and that's divided up by the type of education that you might provide, including fair housing or pre-purchase homebuyer education workshops or post-purchase workshops. Section 9 is where you'll record the one-on-one counseling or individual counseling, and that's also divided by the type of counseling service that the client is receiving. So for example, for this course, we've been talking a lot about pre-purchase home buying right here in Section C. In Section 10, you'll record the impacts of the one-on-one counseling services that you provide. You might you'll notice that you are probably providing more than one impact, and HUD actually wants us to report more than one impact in Section 10. So for example, you probably have quite a few clients that would receive A, sorry, I'm getting used to my pen here, households that receive one-on-one counseling that also received group education services. So they came to one-on-one counseling and they came to group education. They may also receive information on fair housing, because you probably use that in your group education course. They also probably, if they came to one-on-one counseling, they did a budget with you. And they probably, if you did follow-up counseling with them, improved their credit score or decreased their debt load or increased their savings. So far we have 4 different services or impacts that you can note here. And then as time goes on, they may also close on a home. So you may add J also as an additional impact. So one household could actually serve 5 or maybe more impacts in Section 10. And that is how HUD would like us to use this section of the 9902, so that they can show clearly exactly how we're serving our clients and how much people can benefit from housing counseling services. Let's talk about biennial reviews or audits by HUD. HUD conducts a review about once every 2 years. I think this is the timing has become more flexible, so it's not necessarily predictably every 2 years. You have a biennial performance review form in your resources that you could use to prepare for an audit. The audit would cover all the areas that we've discussed in this course, so if you are implementing everything that we've discussed, you should be fine. And if you have a problem, then you should contact your HUD representative or certifying entity to help you to correct any errors. Again, I feel that the purpose of the HUD review is to identify if you're not following all the HUD guidelines, and if you're not, then the next step is to help you make the changes that are necessary to meet all of the guidelines. HUD requires agencies to do periodic internal file reviews. Agencies should write an oversight plan detailing when the files are reviewed, who is responsible for the review, and the steps taken to adjust the policies when there are inadequate files. So, for example, a manager might review a file or a few files per counselor monthly using a checklist, and then if the files are inadequate, then you would have some plan in place for how to point out the errors and correct them, and note any changes that you're making in your policies as time goes on. This concludes Section 6, or Unit 6. Thank you.